We're here in beautiful Amsterdam at Blockchain Expo, and we meet interesting people like Josh Lawler. Yeah, could you please introduce yourself, Josh?
Absolutely. Josh Lawler. I am a partner at the law firm Zuber Lawler in Del Duca, where I head our new technology group, and particularly securities law, mergers and acquisitions in context of distributed ledger technology and blockchain.
Yes, there are several cases, of course, in this industry. Let's start with Binance. Actually, Binance has started Binance US. They're planning to start in September, I think, and they had actually an American company, BAM Trading Services, that has a FinCEN registration. Is that a viable, robust framework to get regulated in the U.S.?
Well, it's very unfortunate. I was actually trading on Binance at the time when this announcement was made and was very frustrated by it. What's really happening is that they're eliminating our ability to trade, our being the U.S., ability to trade pairs that include tokens that could be considered securities that haven't registered and don't have the proper public reporting for a security. So Binance is basically saying, yes, we understand we've got U.S. persons, and yes, we buy the SEC's arguments are violating the law. They didn't admit that, but that's basically what they're saying. So we're creating a new platform. New platform will have only assets that cannot possibly be securities. So Bitcoin, Ether, great. Most of the altcoins, not so much.
So is this devastating for some of the altcoins?
Yeah, it makes things very difficult. I would say it's not devastating in terms of their speculative interest. It may cause a blip while United States folks get out of some of those. So yeah, there may be a drop in value there, but it'll be made up. It's very devastating from a use case perspective. It makes it very hard for the use case of a project to function properly if the U.S. market is basically outlawed because the people using the use case don't have a way to monetize the tokens.
And if you focus on the legislative position of Binance in the U.S., is that enough to use an existing company registered in with FinCEN to run an exchange?
FinCEN is covering the KYC AML aspect of it, and that I think is pretty globally recognized in the developed world at this point. The laws don't quite mesh, but I think they're going to get closer to it than the securities laws. What Binance is doing is, they've got somebody who's already got the right licenses in place, which saves them the time of going to get them and the expense of going to get them. And also, if you're Binance and you've been doing this stuff which is potentially breaking U.S. law for as long as they have, I think that they would have a lot of trouble getting through the system to get the proper licenses if they hadn't acquired a company that already had them.
And if you look at their offering in the U.S., then it will be totally different than the U.S. folks can trade now. I mean, it will be like a small list.
Yeah, a much smaller list. There's a few projects that have dodged it, and some of the older ones where there's considered to be enough decentralization that there's no issuer, basically. There's nobody controlling it. The SEC seems to be letting those go. It'll be interesting to see what happens with some of the tweener cases. If I was Ripple, I'd be concerned.
Oh yeah, why?
Because they're very centralized. Ripple is a completely centralized project, so they've got their tokens out there. They weren't necessarily issued in an ICO because they've been around before ICOs existed per se, but they also have horrible public reporting. They're not putting out anything close to what would look like a financial statement or balance sheet, which wouldn't make sense for them to do, but nonetheless is what the law requires. So the SEC hasn't said anything about them yet. I would love to see how they rule on that one.
Yeah, but XRP as a token is offered in several American exchanges as well. So.
I own some myself, absolutely. But the American law is very unsettled and unclear. Compared to the rest of the world, a lot of the world, we're absolutely a mess, comparatively speaking. So, time will tell. Maybe. The SEC doesn't rule by really establishing; they rule by enforcement and giving kind of very fuzzy guidance that allows them to do what they want later, which they have their reasons. I'm not saying they're evil. There's definitely a place for regulation. It's important, but they're very bad at clarity. They're very bad at bright line rules.
Another case that's quite interesting is, of course, the lawsuit between SEC and Kik Messenger. What's the status? Does Kik have any chance?
No, in a word, they really don't. They tried to position themselves publicly as if they did. As if they did everything right, but regrettably for Kik, there is all kinds of evidence that, in fact, they didn't do everything right, and in fact, it was, I'm not going to say fraudulent, but at least shady in terms of how it all went. And quite honestly, they're a proper target for enforcement.
What was shady, actually?
They're positioning themselves as if they had a fully workable system that the token was going to fit into. They positioned themselves as if they weren't selling it as an investment at the time, but in fact they absolutely were. And their system was, superficial at best. They broke the law, quite honestly. They actually did break the law, and as a project goes, there's not really much redeeming about them. You're not talking about one of these platform projects that's, fostering distributed applications. It was an internal software messaging app that they were selling emojis on. Yeah, no, okay. Yeah, nothing redeeming.
All right. This lawsuit can take years. Yeah.
It could. I don't think that it's going to go all the way through. I think Kik is going to run out of money for their extremely high-priced but very good law firm, and I think the SEC has got enough evidence that it becomes very silly to keep throwing money out of it. They should and probably will sign a consent decree, just like Paragon, just like AirFox, and go down that route, which really is what they should have done in the first place, given what the facts are.
Yeah, last year there was this decentralized exchange called EtherDelta, but they actually got away, or...
They got away to China. Yeah. EtherDelta was started in the United States, but sold to some Chinese nationals operating out of China, and the SEC has no way to touch EtherDelta from an enforcement standpoint. And they gave the guy who started it a slap on the wrist, not improperly. It was not a guy who was trying to do anything wrong. He didn't commit fraud. He just didn't know, which in the U.S. is not an excuse. But they didn't throw the book at him, and they shouldn't. But the SEC can't really do anything to a lot of the DEXs. It'll be interesting to see what the rest of the world does from a KYC perspective, but from a securities law perspective, it's a problem for the SEC.
Because then we go back to Binance. Some of the people say, okay, the Binance DEX will not be allowed in the US. No. That's true.
Because Binance is running it. The Binance DEX, it's a decentralized technically, but it's not decentralized practically. It's Binance. Binance wants to be global. They want to be above board. They're not going to do anything that is, they have been doing something questionable, but they're going to stop doing things that are questionable. But there are plenty of other DEXs. They don't have the same level of liquidity, but there's a lot of services now that are acting to combine the liquidity of the multiple DEXs as kind of a secondary exchange system. And, it's really hard to block. You can VPN in, and that gets you around geofencing if you're US. You can't get around KYC. The question is a DEX that's not located in the United States going to look at your KYC, which they will do because they don't want the global community coming down on them. But say it's a US passport, we're not going to let you trade. I don't think they're going to bar that. I think they're going to want to have the transaction volume and recognize that they're really just very difficult for the SEC to get at.
So if you look at some other exchanges like Bittrex, for instance, they didn't get a bit license in New York State because there were some accounts that were like from North Korea or South Korea. I'm not sure what's the status on all these Poloniacs, Bittrex.
So if you've got accounts from North Korea, you've got a problem everywhere. So that's it's not going to do it. But New York enacted a bit license law, and it was the first state that enacted anything. And I think it's universally considered now to have not been very appropriate. It was a good shot. It's way too difficult to get a bit license. Bittrex pulled out, Kraken pulled out of New York. You know, that is what it is, and they're revising that. But you know, the United States laws per se, for the same reason we were talking about earlier with Binance, same laws apply to Bittrex. Bittrex has had problems with that. The SEC went after Bitfinex, and Bitfinex pulled out of the U.S. altogether, you know, a year and a half ago.
Hong Kong.
Yeah. You know, it's limited trading in the U.S., and the U.S. market's going to get very interesting for tokens that were properly issued in private offerings after they come off their holding periods and become unrestricted securities.
You have examples?
Well, I mean, anything that's been doing an STO, as they're called, in the U.S. is using, you know, an exemption from the Securities Act, Rule 506C, is what it's called, and there's a 1-year holding period. After the 1 year, unless you're an affiliate of the company, you can sell an unrestricted transaction. Now, the exchange can't facilitate it unless you've got financial reporting going on, which you don't. But it doesn't mean that the things can't be sold on a peer-to-peer basis, which, you know, a lot of the DEXs come close to doing, not being an order book really. That law's got to change. There's a lot of laws in the U.S. that, you know, it's a game attempt to fit everything into the current system. Not everything fits into the current system.
Yeah, they're looking into the transactions and not in the character or the intrinsic value of the token. I mean,
but, you know, it's funny you mention they're looking at the intrinsic value of the token, but that doesn't really mean anything on a consumptive use token. What does mean something actually is the transaction, and they're focused on the initial transaction, which has been a capital raise and definitely a regulated transaction in my opinion. But what they're not looking at is subsequent to that use case transactions. So for instance, you know, if your use case is micropayments to content creators based on royalties and you're paying people, you know, 4 cents at a time because they had some aspect of creating a piece of music that somebody plays, you know, that's not really a securities transaction and shouldn't be a securities transaction. But the way that American law is right now, arguably, and the SEC would certainly argue, yes, that's transaction securities. That's silly. That's law that needs to change.
Yeah. So the whole law is not applicable on this utility token within a closed ecosystem.
Well, yeah, a closed ecosystem actually takes you out of things at that point. At that point, you know, it's very difficult to have a token increase in value in a closed ecosystem, and the result of that is it's very hard to call that an investment. However, most of the use cases require some type of outside liquidity, so they're not closed ecosystems, you know, almost by definition. And you know, again, it becomes silly that like if there's a way to characterize things based on the most recent transaction and what that actually was instead of just the initial transaction forever, that would make a lot of sense. It's, you know, an idea that's starting to get turned over in the U.S. It'll be a long time before that goes anywhere, but we can try.
The last topic we will touch about, it's of course the Facebook chain or Facebook coin, Libra.
Yes.
What's your take on that? Because they're regulated in Switzerland with an association. They have 1% share in that association, but to the outside world it seems like, yeah, Facebook is stepping in.
Yeah. So the association, which has its separate token, which is only, you know, you need to put $10 million up right now, and that's effectively a lot of folks trying to be a bank. They make money taking float off the fiat currency that's sitting to back the Libra tokens, and that's great, and that's fine.
STO, huh?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is, and it's also extremely private. I mean, you've got 24 purchasers. They're all extremely sophisticated. It's just not something the SEC cares about. It's not a public offering. The Libra tokens themselves, because they're pegged to fiat currency, that arguably and probably gets them around being called a security. But it's really interesting what they did. By having it pegged to a basket of fiat currencies, not just a single one, they eat in on the ability of central banks to regulate their currencies, because if you drop interest rates on something that really is, as compared to the other currencies out there, interest rates are all very low right now. If you've got a Libra token that gets a lot of adoption to the point where it becomes material and significant, and it's based off a basket of currencies, then it messes with the money supply dynamics. I don't think that's going to be allowed to happen in a lot of places. Now, that said, Facebook, I think, is targeting a very big user base it has in kind of the unbanked developing world, and I think that's a phenomenal use case for them, and it's laudable, it's wonderful, it's a problem that needs to be solved. So, it's very mixed. It'll be interesting to see what happens. They've announced it to, start out in 2020, which I don't think is a mistake. I think they're giving themselves lots of time for the regulators to kind of chime in and to work with them and see what they need to do to make the thing function. Business-wise, I think, considering they need to get off the advertising model, all the privacy issues they're having, it's a pretty good swing. It's a pretty good attempt.
Oh, you think so? It's separate? You don't think they will monetize the payment data?
No, I don't. In the US, they would actually be very much breaking the law if they did. There's something called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. Nobody's really heard of it because it doesn't really matter in this world thus far, but it is a privacy act that's applicable to the banks and the other financial institutions. Selling financial data is a big no-no. Even if you've got people who opt in, but I feel pretty confident on this one. There's no way that the United States or really the European governments are going to allow that to happen. It violates the hell out of GDPR, which how this all works with GDPR is very questionable also.
Because there is some resistance when the banking committee and some Congress members are resistant to the idea of this Libra token or coin.
Yeah, it's very difficult in the U.S. to really understand. There's so much political grandstanding. It's a major announcement that comes out. It grabs attention. Anytime you're in an election year, somebody's going to think that they can, get some ground on an election by coming out with a strong stance against. I don't even know that they know what they're talking about. Honestly, they have, certainly policy analysts who can brief them, but I put a lot more stock in what the central banks are saying, and frankly what some of the European leaders are saying, who don't have that same kind of motivation in a lot of cases. But it needs to shake out. It's a big announcement, it's different, and we all need to get our heads around it before we're really going to come to any kind of a decision.
Do you think it will be regulated, and will it be a regulated coin?
Well, from a KYC AML perspective, absolutely. They're definitely a money transmitter. There's no question about it. So yes, it will be regulated. I don't think it's actually a security in the U.S. sense of it, the way they've got it set up. So probably not the SEC, probably not the CFTC, maybe if somebody ever does derivatives. And I don't think anybody's actually talked about the idea of derivatives to the Libra token, but it's a really interesting concept. That would be regulated. But I think a lot of it actually just comes to the sovereign nations and recognizing that it's a big inroad on their currency controls, and
will that lead to friction because they use this basket of monetary?
Yeah, I think it has to. I don't see how it doesn't.
So what will be the result?
The result will be that the sun will rise and the sun will set, and the tides will go in and out. I can't tell you what the results are going to be right now. What I will say is Facebook has a lot of money behind it to make things work. I think they'll find a way to make things work. It may or may not look like what their white paper says right now.
Okay.
Hard to say.
Thank you very much, Josh, for your time and your insights. And yeah, perhaps we can end with we are also cryptocurrency focused platform. So, do you have any personal favorites? Or
all right. So this is not legal advice. This is not investment advice. I'm not an investment advisor. I do have some favorites. You know, I'll give a shout out to the Raven Coin guys who were here last night. I think they've got a fantastic project that is very, very different in the sense that it's extremely grassroots. So I think that that's a good one. You know, Link, if you're familiar with that, just announced a partnership with Google, and I think that that's got a lot of potential. VeChain, I like a lot in terms of what they're able to do with their technology. Stellar is fantastic as a payment processing system. I don't particularly like Bitcoin because it doesn't scale and it doesn't suit its original purpose, but I can't deny that, you know, it has the trademark goodwill, if you will, going for it. And, you know, if you're looking for the cryptocurrency that's the least likely to just kind of drop suddenly at this point, I'm feeling pretty good about what the technical charts look like for that. I do think crypto winter is probably over, and it's difficult to make the kind of money on Bitcoin that you can do on some of these micro cap tokens because, you know, obviously for Bitcoin to increase 100% now, it's got to go from 9,000 to 18,000. Whereas for Ripple to increase 100%, it's got to go from 44 cents to 88 cents. It's, you know, and Ripple's been up to $3 before. So it depends what you're trying to do. It all depends what you're trying to do.
Okay. Thank you very much, Josh, for your time, and all the best.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, Whistle.